These experiments were not run in secret. They came from federal agencies and hospitals people trusted. A leaflet promised free treatment. A child's breakfast carried a dose nobody could taste. One study here changed how doctors understood a virus, and that would not make it forgivable. One document from a courtroom would decide what every doctor owes every patient. The blood that was never bad. A leaflet went out to sharecroppers across Macon County, Alabama, promising special free treatment. It reached them in 1932, mailed under the seal of the United States Public Health Service. Doctors of that era believed syphilis behaved differently in black patients, striking the heart rather than the mind, and treated that belief as a license to observe the disease instead of treating it. Left alone, the infection can sit in the body for years with almost no visible sign, then behave like termites working through a house frame, invisible for years, until the structure gives out all at once. The men were told they had bad blood and handed aspirin and vitamins, dressed up as care. Herman Shaw was 30, a cotton farmer chasing a free checkup during the Depression when he signed on. He carried the infection for 4 decades before anyone spoke the word syphilis about his own body. When draft boards ordered treatment for men entering World War II, the agency's own staff worked to keep known study participants off the list. Raymond Vonderlehr, who ran the study, had put the real plan in writing back in 1933, describing it as continued observation, with the idea of eventually bringing the men to autopsy. They thought they were signing up to fight a war. Their own government was fighting to keep a chart intact. The kindest man in the ward. John Cutler carried a scalpel into a locked ward in Guatemala City in February of 1948.
Doctors of the post-war years treated venereal disease less as an illness needing care than as a threat to a soldier's readiness, something to defeat ahead of the next war. Cutler's team scraped a patient's skin and introduced a mixture carrying live syphilis bacteria, a method called inoculation, meaning the organism was deliberately introduced rather than caught through natural exposure. Testing a prevention method this way worked something like checking a fire extinguisher by setting a small fire first. Except the person standing in the flames never agreed to the test. Guatemalan officials working alongside Cutler credited him for the American penicillin and hospital supplies his grants brought to their underfunded wards, with little idea what was happening behind locked doors. One patient in Cutler's files is recorded only by a first name, Berta. Her age was never written down. She was infected in February, then left deliberately untreated for months while her condition worsened. In August, doctors deliberately reinfected her with additional disease. She died before the month was out. Cutler's superior, Thomas Perrin, had already put in writing that the United States could never run an experiment like this at home. It ran anyway, protected by distance and by a reputation nobody in Guatemala thought to question. Breakfast with a hidden dose. A bowl of cereal sat waiting in the dining hall at the Fernald School in Massachusetts, carrying a radioactive tracer no spoon could ever taste. Fernald's nutrition studies ran across the late 1940s and early 1950s, with the radioactive iron study in 1946 and radioactive calcium studies from 1950 to 1953. Researchers of the era saw radioactive tracers as a marvel rather than a hazard, a new way to literally watch how the body absorbed nutrients, a tool that felt more like a telescope than a threat. The method worked like a drop of dye stirred into a full swimming pool, invisible to the swimmer, but trackable by instruments watching where it flowed. Boys at Fernald joined a so-called science club for the perks that came with it: extra meals, ball game tickets, small gifts handed out to members. Fred Boyce was 8 years old when he arrived at Fernald in 1949, an orphan who joined the club without ever being told his cereal was part of a radiation study. Consent forms sent to guardians described a new kind of nutrition research. They never mentioned radiation. Decades later, in 1994, Senator Edward Kennedy chaired a hearing where he pointedly asked why researchers hadn't tested the isotope on the children of MIT's own scientists instead. Boyce learned what had happened to him from a radio broadcast that winter, and later helped organize former Fernald residents in the lawsuit that followed. Acres of skin. It was presented to the men of Holmesburg Prison as a simple way to earn a little money and help science move forward. Beginning in 1951, dermatologist Albert Kligman began taping occlusive patches, test squares kept sealed against the skin for a set period of time, soaked in industrial chemicals, dyes, and radioactive isotopes, onto inmates.
for research funded by the U.S. Army and private industry. Prison medicine of that period treated incarcerated men as a controlled, convenient population, isolated from outside variables, and paid only a few dollars a session, so consent barely entered the conversation at all. Picture a labeled board covered in small test squares, each one holding a different substance so researchers could compare reactions side by side. Except the board here was a living man's back. Kligman later described his first walk through the prison in blunt terms. All he saw before him were acres of skin.
Edward Farrington later alleged that radioactive injections he received in 1967 caused the leukemia he developed years afterward. He sued in 1990. The case was settled quietly 2 years later, with the defendants denying wrongdoing and admitting no liability. Kligman's work on the prison's damaged skin also led him to a patent for Retin A in 1967, a cream that went on to become one of the best-known anti-wrinkle treatments in the world, developed on the skin of men who had no say in any of it. Chocolate milk and a virus. At Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, hepatitis spread so easily through the crowded wards that doctors argued new arrivals were likely to catch it regardless. The hepatitis studies began in 1955, led by Dr. Saul Krugman, who deliberately exposed some children under controlled conditions.
An incubation period is the gap between infection and visible symptoms, and controlling it mattered to how the team tracked the disease. Hepatitis spreads person to person the way a lit match passes from hand to hand, and Krugman's team collected stool from already infected children, prepared an extract from it, and mixed that extract into chocolate milk served to healthy new arrivals. Parents, desperate for a placement, signed consent forms after a letter describing the work as a study in preventing epidemics, worded so gently that few understood their child would be deliberately infected. Bernard Carabello entered Willowbrook at age 3 and spent 18 years there, his mind fully intact despite cerebral palsy that left him unable to speak clearly. In 1972, a sympathetic physician arranged access for reporter Geraldo Rivera, and Carabello helped the cameras get inside and document what daily life there actually looked like.
Rivera's broadcast intensified public pressure, and a lawsuit filed that same year led to the Willowbrook Consent Decree 3 years later, reshaping disability rights nationwide. Krugman's research there also fed into decades of hepatitis B science, a contribution that never made what happened to the children forgivable. 20,000 X-rays at once. A concrete-walled room at Cincinnati General Hospital held a machine loaded with cobalt-60, a radioactive metal used to aim radiation at a target, built there to answer a military question rather than a medical one. From 1960 to 1971, Dr. Eugene Sanger's team, funded in part by the Pentagon, seated patients with advanced, inoperable cancer in a hunched position meant to mimic a soldier bracing for a nuclear blast, then irradiated their entire bodies at once. Whole-body exposure worked something like switching from a flashlight aimed at one spot to every ceiling light in a room turned on together.
Cold War planners needed to know how long a man could keep fighting after a nuclear strike, and cancer wards gave them a supply of patients nobody outside the hospital was watching closely. A single session delivered radiation roughly equal to 20,000 chest X-rays compressed into about an hour. Medical records documented acute illness and disorientation within hours of treatment. 21 patients died within a month. Military reports pointed to their existing cancer, while the families who later sued pointed to the dose. Parthenia Marshall was 82 years old when she was irradiated. She died in 1982, and it took her granddaughter, Anna Foster, and dozens of other families years of litigation before a court approved a settlement in 1999. The men measuring combat readiness never once measured Marshall's consent. The candy built to stick. Dental researchers in 1940 Sweden believed the link between sugar and caries, the technical term for tooth decay, could only be proven by watching decay happen in real time, under controlled conditions. From 1945 to 1955, the government partnered with the candy industry at Vipeholm Hospital in Lund to test exactly that idea on patients who could not simply refuse. Institutionalized patients were treated as a convenient, controlled population, easier to study than free citizens who might just say no to somebody else's diet plan. Researchers commissioned candy makers to build a toffee deliberately less pleasant but maximally sticky, engineered to cling to enamel the way syrup left on a spoon overnight hardens into a shell nothing rinses away. One patient, identified in later academic research only by the initial B, developed cavities severe enough that surgical extraction became the only option. No fuller identity or age survives in the published record. Documented accounts describe dozens of patients left with permanent, irreversible damage to their teeth. The results proved the sugar link conclusively, and the government ended research on Vipaholm's patients that same year, in July of 1955. A clipboard instead of treatment. Herbert Green looked through a colposcope, an instrument that magnifies the cervix for close examination, at a young patient in Auckland, New Zealand, and wrote down what he saw instead of removing it. Between 1966 and the early 1980s, Green managed abnormal, precancerous cervical cells by observation rather than treatment, convinced they rarely turned dangerous. Many gynecologists of his generation removed a womb at the first hint of abnormal cells, and Green genuinely believed he was sparing women from unnecessary surgery.
Leaving the disease to run its own course was like watching a crack spread slowly across a windshield, instead of pulling into a shop to have it fixed while it was still small. Claire Matheson, publicly known for years under the pseudonym Ruth, was 80 years old when a professional medical college formally apologized to her in 2017. She lived to see that acknowledgement and kept pressing for accountability afterward. A 1984 analysis followed 948 women treated at the hospital. Among the 131 whose abnormal cells were never treated, 29 later developed invasive cancer. Green published his findings openly in medical journals for years. The dispute eventually moved into a public inquiry centered on consent, follow-up care, and patient rights, reshaping how New Zealand screens for cervical cancer today. The rule written after the fire.
Proceedings opened in Nuremberg in December of 1946 against 23 Nazi physicians and officials accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity for their experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Defense lawyers argued wartime experimentation on prisoners wasn't uniquely German, pointing to research already happening in other countries, including the United States. Judges answered with a formal set of principles for permissible human research. Writing rules only after a catastrophe is already finished works like posting a fire exit sign on a building that is already burned to the ground. Useful for the next fire, permanently too late for everyone already inside. The tribunal announced its verdicts in August of 1947. 16 defendants were convicted. 7 received death sentences, and the resulting Nuremberg Code opened with a single principle. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential.
Karl Brandt, once Adolf Hitler's personal physician, was one of the 7. He was 44 years old when he was hanged at Landsberg prison on June 2, 1948. The contradiction reached well beyond Germany. The Tuskegee study had already been running in Alabama for 15 years when the judges read that principle aloud. And American-funded syphilis experiments in Guatemala were already underway the same year the trial began. The document meant to end this kind of story became the standard every case on this list would eventually be judged against. One signature, one silent patient, one unread form at a time. If one of these cases deserves its own full video, say which one in the comments and subscribe for the next case.